They say love is timeless. But in the hushed silence of the medieval world, love was less a fire and more a flicker, gentle, restrained, yet achingly real. In a world without dating apps or even true privacy, courtship was a ceremony of patience. You didn't meet someone by chance. You were introduced, supervised, and measured like fine cloth. Every glance had weight. Every word, a contract between hope and propriety. It wasn't uncommon to fall in love without ever touching. A lingering gaze across a marketplace, a whispered compliment under a moonlit archway, a stolen smile beneath layers of lace and custom. For the noble and the peasant alike, courtship was not just about desire. It was about honor, land, dowries, and duty. But amid the rules and the rituals, hearts still found ways to speak. Knights would compose verses to their beloved, even if she belonged to another. Ladies would wear a token, a scarf, a handkerchief, as if to say, "I remember you." They called it courtly love, a love that bloomed in the mind, not the body. Passionate, yearning, yet untouched, and still. Was it not love, all the same? You imagine them, two souls orbiting each other for years, bound by obligation, but hoping quietly that one day they might simply walk beside each other. Medieval courtship was slow, but maybe that's what made it sacred. A kind of sacred that stays with you, even in your sleep. Would you have waited for love, if love had no voice but poetry? Now, if you're still awake, let's keep wandering through time. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, love letters and secret messages. In the quiet corridors of stone castles and candlelit chambers, where voices could be overheard and footsteps echoed secrets, love learned to speak in silence. A letter, folded carefully, sealed with wax, tucked inside a glove, hidden beneath a servant's tray, slipped between the pages of a prayer book. In medieval times, writing was a sacred act. To send a letter was to send a piece of your soul, your thoughts, fears, longing, pressed between parchment and ink. Many lovers never touched hands, but they touched minds. Through poetry, through coded words, through metaphors as delicate as lace. I dream of hawks in flight, one might write, and the other would understand. I dream of you. They invented codes to avoid detection. The wrong hands could mean ruin or worse, a marriage annulled, a life imprisoned, a name forever stained. So they became poets, masters of suggestion. Symbols replaced names, and metaphors disguised desire. Imagine a young woman tracing each line with trembling fingers, by firelight, rereading it like prayer. Or a knight on campaign, tucking a letter into his armor, a talisman against death, a reminder of home. Sometimes the letter never arrived. Sometimes it was intercepted. Sometimes it came too late. But even then, the words lived on, carried in memory, whispered like wind in the rafters. Tonight, as you drift slowly, let your mind wander to a world where love needed no voice, only ink and courage. What might you have written if your heart had only one letter to give? And would it have been enough? Let yourself rest in the silence between the words. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, arranged matches. Family over feelings. In the hush of ancient stone halls, where names were more valuable than affection, love was not always a choice. It was an arrangement. A daughter's heart belonged not to herself, but to the strategy of the household. A son's future was not drawn by desire, but by the ink of alliance. Arranged marriages weren't considered cruel. They were expected. They were the architecture of society, built not on romance, but on inheritance, on borders, on land. Imagine being 13, and promised to someone twice your age, someone you've never met, someone chosen because his family held a key to your father's ambition, not your heart. Yet, even within these boundaries, the soul still searched for comfort. Some matches became gentle friendships, others quiet resentments, and a rare few bloomed into something surprisingly tender. But at first, there was no ceremony of falling in love, only signatures, rings, coins, and a quiet farewell to childhood. Wives moved far from home, into unfamiliar languages, unfamiliar customs, sometimes even into rival territories. They were asked to birth heirs, to carry loyalty on their shoulders like veils of silk. And yet, they laughed. They gardened. They whispered their secrets into the night, finding small freedoms where they could. Tonight, let yourself wonder. What does it mean to be chosen? Not for who you are, but for what you represent. And if you were born in that world, would you still believe in love? Let the weight of these old decisions settle gently around you, like old linen sheets, and when the stillness feels right. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the token of love. Gifting a glove. It wasn't diamonds that spoke of devotion, but cloth, soft leather, the warmth of something worn close to the skin. In the medieval world, where spoken love was often forbidden, where touches were few and fleeting, lovers found new languages. A glove, gifted, kissed, or held, became a symbol that said everything words could not. To give a glove was to give a trace of yourself. A knight might wear his lady's glove on his helm into battle, letting the world know. He rides not only for honor, but for her, for a woman. To accept a glove was to whisper yes, without ever saying the word. It was to take someone into your palm without drawing a gaze. Some gloves were embroidered with initials, others perfumed, carrying the scent of lavender or rosemary, a memory to inhale when distance grew long. In courts, tournaments, and silent meetings beneath moonlight, gloves passed from hand to hand, sometimes wrapped in silk, sometimes tucked into saddlebags. And when words were dangerous, they carried all the weight of a promise. Imagine it. Someone hands you a glove, worn and softened by their skin. They say nothing, but in that moment, you understand. This was love in its quietest form. A gesture, a fragment, a symbol passed through time like a secret heirloom. And even now, centuries later, the memory lingers. Not all love needs to shout. Some just needs to be worn. As your thoughts float deeper into sleep, ask yourself gently, what small token would you give if it had to speak for your entire heart when you're ready to explore further? Or, now, let's move on to the next chapter, the role of astrologers in finding a match. Before wedding bells rang, before contracts were signed or glances exchanged across candlelit halls, the stars were consulted. In the medieval world, love was not just a matter of hearts. It was a matter of heavens. Astrologers were summoned to study the skies, to map the positions of the planets, to interpret the angles of fate. A marriage, after all, was not simply between two people. It was a convergence of destinies. And who better to decode the language of the divine than those who read the stars? A noble family might delay a wedding for weeks, waiting for Venus to rise, or for Saturn to soften its gaze. The bride's birth chart would be spread open beside the groom's, their moons compared, their houses aligned, their fates braided like threads in the loom of the cosmos. A favorable alignment meant prosperity, fertility, harmony. A poor one might mean bloodshed, betrayal, or a barren womb. Even skeptics dared not defy the stars. For in a world full of plague and politics, one needed all the guidance one could gather, earthly and celestial. And yet, Within this ancient science, there was mystery. Whispers of soulmates, of lives meant to intertwine across time, of karmic debts and spiritual contracts signed long before the cradle. Imagine someone studying the moment you were born, calculating the curve of your life, and deciding, this is the person you are destined to walk beside. Is that fate? Or is it faith dressed in numbers and constellations? Tonight, look up, even if only in your mind's eye. Trace a path from one distant star to another. Could that be the journey of two lovers, slowly circling one another, life after life? Breathe in the stillness of that thought. Let it settle over you like stardust. And when you're ready to return to Earth. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, marriage by proxy. What if you were married, without ever meeting the person whose name would become tied to yours? What if your wedding vows were spoken by someone else? In the medieval world, love didn't always require presents. Sometimes, all it required was parchment, permission, and a stand-in. Marriage by proxy was a union born of distance, of duty, of politics moving faster than horses could ride. A noblewoman in France might wed a prince in Scotland through a third man, a proxy groom, who stood at the altar, offered his hand, and recited vows on behalf of the absent groom. There would be a ceremony. There would be a ring. There might even be a kiss, given not from love, but obligation. And yet, the marriage would be real, legally binding, spiritually recognized. Sometimes, the real couple wouldn't meet for weeks, months, or even years. Imagine her, draped in ceremonial fabric, listening to the words that would bind her to a stranger, wondering what his voice sounded like, whether his eyes were kind, whether she would find him waiting with warmth or with cold expectation. Imagine him, far away, writing letters to a wife he's never touched, wondering if she dreams of him or fears him. In a time when kingdoms could rise or fall on a wedding, love had to wait. Sometimes it never came at all, but sometimes. When the couple finally met, there was laughter. There was connection. There was something tender and surprising that no proxy could ever predict. Could love arrive after the vow? Could hearts follow where papers led? Tonight, let your thoughts drift to the space between names and faces, to that moment of wondering, who have I been promised to in dreams? Now, let's move on to the next chapter, sacred oaths at the church door, before altars gleamed with stained glass and choirs echoed vows. There was the threshold, the place where love met law. In the early medieval centuries, marriages were not always celebrated inside churches. Instead, they unfolded just outside, at the church door, a sacred boundary between the ordinary and the divine. Not quite inside God's house, but close enough to be seen. There, in the open air, couples would stand, not as lovers wrapped in mystery, but as two souls, bare and public. Witnessed by clergy, kin, and curious eyes, they would declare their intentions aloud. It was called the handfasting, a ritual where hands were joined, oaths spoken, and promises made in the presence of heaven and earth alike. I take thee, one would say, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. Yes, even then, the words we know today had early echoes. Words not merely spoken, but woven into the fabric of their fates. It wasn't about flowers or lace. There was no music, no procession, no ring exchanged in lavish halls. Just the wind, the watchers, and the weight of the vow. Why at the door? Because marriage was more than a private affair. It was a contract of community, a public shift in status. And the doorway was where the soul crossed into a new life. Some cried, some trembled, Some barely understood what they promised. But all walked away changed. Tonight, rest with this thought. How powerful must words be when spoken between stone and sky? Now let's move on to the next chapter, wedding rings. Symbolism and superstition. A circle. No beginning, no end. Just one endless path. Bound by silence, worn by time. The wedding ring, so simple in form, yet in the medieval world, it shimmered with meaning deeper than gold. To slip a ring onto a finger was not just a gesture of love. It was an invocation, a binding, a spell perhaps. To tether one soul to another in the eyes of the heavens. Many believed the fourth finger of the left hand held a special vein. The vena amoris, the vein of love, said to run straight to the heart. A myth perhaps, but a beautiful one. And isn't that the truth of many things we choose to believe? Rings were more than tokens. They were talismans. Etched with prayers, Latin inscriptions, even tiny protective symbols to guard against betrayal or sorrow. Some were made of gold, others of braided hair, some from iron, rough, heavy, a reminder that love could also be a burden. Superstitions bloomed around them like ivy. To drop the ring during the ceremony was a terrible omen. To wear it before the vow was a whisper to misfortune, and to lose it was to fear the unraveling of the bond itself. Yet still, the ring endured. Because even in those days of arranged matches and political unions, people longed to believe that something as small as a band of metal could carry hope, could hold love, could outlast both. And tonight, as you close your fingers slowly in the dark, imagine a ring there. Warm, steady, ancient. A circle not of possession, but of promise. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the binding of hands, the origin of tying the knot. Two hands, yours and mine, reaching, trembling, meeting. And then, something sacred happens. They are bound. Before modern weddings, before officiants rid from scripts and ribbons draped gently down aisles, there was a thread, a cord, a piece of cloth, wound around two hands as they touched palm to palm. This was the hand-fasting ritual, the ancient act of literally tying the knot. In the medieval world, it was both ceremony and contract, a physical symbol of two lives being braided together, not just in body, but in spirit and fate. The priest or elder would take the couple's joined hands and wrap them with a ribbon or strand of woven wool, sometimes even a strip from the bride's dress. One loop for loyalty, one for fidelity, one for unity through all things to come. In some traditions, the knot would stay tied for a year and a day, as a trial marriage, a way to learn not just to love, but to live. And while some hand-fastings were formalized later into church marriages, many were never undone. Because once the knot was tied, hearts often followed. Imagine the feeling, standing in a forest glade or village green, your hand in another's, watching as something binds you together, gently, firmly, irrevocably. No ring required, just the warmth of skin, the stillness of breath shared, and the knowing. To tie a knot was to promise that no matter what storms may come, you would be tethered, not trapped, held, not owned. Even now you can almost feel it, that invisible thread between you and the ones you've loved. Tangled, perhaps, but never broken. Tonight, may you rest in the comfort of that soft, ancient cord, woven of hope, knotted in quiet trust. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the morning gift, a promise of provision. Dawn breaks after the wedding night. soft light slipping through stone shutters, the scent of hearth smoke rising from the village below. And beside her, a promise is waiting. It is called the morning gift, Morgengifu in the old tongue. A tradition as old as early medieval Europe, when love and survival intertwined in delicate ways. The morning after a marriage was consummated, the groom was expected to offer his bride a gift, not a bouquet, not a kiss, but something far more lasting. Security. It could be a plot of land, a chest of coins, a house in her name, or a title to carry as armor against a future unknown. This wasn't simply a gesture of affection. It was an agreement, a recognition that in giving herself, she now carried new risks. Childbearing, leaving her family, becoming vulnerable to a world governed by men. And so the morning gift stood as a silent vow. If I cannot protect you with my presence, let this gift protect you in my absence. In royal marriages, morning gifts could be entire towns, grain-producing estates, or lifetime incomes. For commoners, perhaps a cow, a corner of farmland, a gold ring passed down from a mother's hope. It was a moment of grace, sometimes sincere, sometimes strategic, but always telling. She would rise from the marriage bed, take the gift in hand, and step forward into this new life. Not as a girl, but as a wife with means, and a measure of her own. Tonight, let that idea settle gently over you, that even in a world shaped by power and patriarchy, there were glimpses of care, of promise, of provision. And as you drift between breaths, you might ask, what would you have given to say you matter? Now, let's move on to the next chapter, marrying for land, gold, and influence. Once upon a time, love was not the reason for marriage. It was the exception. In the medieval world, a wedding was not the joining of two hearts. It was the collision of two fortunes. A pact signed in soil, in currency, in whispered strategy behind velvet curtains. To marry was to expand borders, to secure peace, to acquire cattle, coin, or castles. Especially among the nobility, a daughter was not simply a beloved child. She was a living treaty, a chess piece positioned to gain more land, more soldiers, more political favor. Imagine this: a father studying a map, not of roads or rivers, but of potential alliances. Each daughter's marriage could seal a boundary, extinguish a feud, or provoke a war. And so, sons were matched with heiresses. Widows were pursued not for love, but for what remained in their coffers. Land-rich nobles married gold-rich merchants. Influence was the true dowry. For the bride, there might be no say. Her future decided while she still played with dolls. But that did not mean she was powerless. A clever woman could influence from within, through her household, through her sons, through the secrets she kept close and the alliances she made in silence. Some queens ruled through marriage. Some duchesses negotiated treaties at the table. And behind many great men, there was a marriage not of romance, but of well-placed ambition. Yet even in this world of gold and gain, there were flickers of humanity. A stolen smile, a glance across a banquet table. And sometimes, against all odds, affection bloomed in the shadow of strategy. Tonight, let your mind wander across that parchment map where marriages stitched together kingdoms and love. If it arrived at all, was a slow-growing seed in soil rich with legacy. What would you give or give up to hold a piece of the world? Now, let's move on to the next chapter, dynastic marriages between kingdoms. A wedding and a war ends. A bride crosses a border and peace is brokered. A child is born and an empire expands. In the medieval world, some marriages didn't just change lives. They redrew maps. These were the dynastic marriages, strategic, calculated, and often decided before the bride could walk. When kingdoms were fragile and alliances held the weight of survival, it was through these sacred unions that thrones were secured, borders softened, and dynasties were built to last generations. Picture a young princess, 14 perhaps, sent from her homeland across distant seas, her name exchanged like coin, her dowry heavier than her suitcase. She leaves behind her language, her customs, her mother's embrace, to marry a prince she's never met, in a land where even the sun seems to rise differently. Her wedding dress embroidered with her nation's crest, a political emblem, not a romantic one. At the altar, she speaks her vows in a foreign tongue. But the real promise was made long before, in the scrolls signed by kings, in the blessings of bishops, in the sighs of aging advisors hoping for one more decade of peace. Sometimes these unions worked. The bride and groom found gentleness in each other, common ground in their shared duty. Sometimes there was distance, disdain, or indifference cold enough to freeze even the warmest bed. Yet still their children would carry two lineages, two bloodlines, and one day, perhaps, a single crown. These marriages were not always kind, but they were powerful, and in their shadow walked queens who learned to rule, to wield diplomacy, to hold power behind the veil of submission. Tonight, as you drift into dreams, imagine yourself not as pawn, but as queen, not voiceless, but watching, always watching, and learning the language of power wrapped in lace. In that quiet strength, can you sense your crown? Now let's move on to the next chapter. The bride as a peace treaty. She was not just a daughter, not merely a woman. She was an offering. In a world where armies bled and banners clashed in the wind, sometimes the cost of peace was a bride. To stop a war, to calm a feud, to seal a fragile truce between warring realms, a young woman would be chosen. Not for her laughter, not for her heart, but for her bloodline. She became the treaty, signed not with ink, but with her life. Imagine the hush that fell over the court when her name was spoken. A stillness heavier than any silence. She would be prepared. Her hands trained in the etiquette of a foreign court, her mouth rehearsed in the greetings of strange nobility. She would ride from the land of her birth toward a place where her presence was both balm and symbol. At the border, she would smile, even as her eyes searched the crowd for someone familiar. There would be no going back, not for years, sometimes not ever. Her marriage bed was lined with diplomacy, her womb expected to bear peace. For each child she birthed, a future less tangled in war. And yet, she was more than a bargaining chip. Many such women became beloved figures. Some softened the hearts of hardened kings. Some ruled in all but name. Some wrote letters that shaped politics, held court with quiet brilliance, and raised children who would later change the face of history. Still, beneath it all, there must have been moments, alone in stone chambers, where she whispered to herself, "Who would I have been if I had been born a son?" Tonight, may her memory rest with you gently, not as victim, but as thread, woven into the fabric of history with dignity and silent resolve. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Child brides and elder grooms. There are stories in history that ache softly, not because they're forgotten, but because they were never truly told aloud. One such story is this, of girls, barely taller than the banquet table, dressed in silks too heavy for their tiny shoulders, Wednesday to men 3, 4, 5 times their age, not in secret, but in ceremony, blessed by priests, witnessed by courts. sealed with scroll and seal. They were called child brides, but no one called it cruelty. It was custom. It was strategy. It was a world where time moved differently for girls. A 7-year-old might be betrothed. A 12-year-old might become a wife. Not always to live together immediately, but the contract would bind them nonetheless. She belonged to him in name, and soon enough, in body too. The groom, often much older, sometimes a man of 40, 50, or more, would take the young girl as a promise, a way to secure heirs, to forge alliances, or to keep titles within reach. And what of the girl? She was praised for obedience, for silence, for maturity beyond her years. But inside, she may have clutched a doll beneath her wedding cloak. She may have whispered her mother's name into the pillow, wishing, just once more, to be held like a child. Not all such marriages were cruel. Some grooms were patient, waiting years before truly claiming their brides. Some even grew to love the child they once saw as a transaction. But many did not wait, and the girl was left to grow up beneath the weight of a man's shadow. Tonight, let your heart sit gently beside hers, not with judgment, but with presence, with the sorrow that acknowledges what cannot be undone, and the compassion to see her, at last, as more than a name in a record. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, marriage and the inheritance game. In the candlelit chambers of medieval castles, inheritance wasn't just a matter of gold and land. It was the reason behind nearly every marriage contract. Love may have written poems, but wealth and bloodlines wrote the vows. To marry was to gamble with the future, to join estates, merge titles, consolidate influence. And every child born became a piece on the board, a living claim, a legal tether, a future lord or lady whose birth could decide the fate of entire regions. Fathers bartered their daughters' hands, not for affection, but for fields, fiefs, and fortresses. And sons, they were bait, used to catch heiresses whose dowries could feed armies, buy knights, or settle decades-long feuds. Imagine this. A widowed noblewoman, still young, owns half a county by inheritance. She can't walk alone without a chaperone, but men twice her age compete for her hand, not for her voice, but for her vineyards, not for her smile, but for the titles in her lineage. Inheritance laws, especially in Europe, were a twisted web. Primogeniture, where the eldest son took all. Salic's law, which barred women from succession entirely. But there were loopholes, and marriage was often the key that unlocked them. A marriage could legitimize a claim. A marriage could disinherit a rival. A marriage could take a distant cousin from obscurity to the gates of a throne. And so, weddings became weapons. Dowries became strategies. And the children, they were not just blessings. They were proof of lineage, of legality, of leverage. Even love itself, when it did appear, had to bow before the ledger. In this world, a kiss could sign a contract, a cradle could start a war, and a widow could be the most valuable prize on the board. So rest now, dear listener, knowing the games of power were not always played with swords. Sometimes they were played in bridal veils and bassinets, with ink and blood and the ever-turning wheel of names. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, Secret Weddings in Moonlight. Not all vows are shouted from towers. Some are whispered beneath willows, lit not by candlelight, but by the hush of the moon. In a world where marriage was duty, where love was often negotiated, some hearts slipped quietly into shadow and chose each other anyway. These were the secret weddings, the ones not bound by scroll or church, but by trembling hands and promises made with no witness but the stars. A noble daughter, promised to a man twice her age, might meet a stable boy at the edge of the forest. A merchant's son forbidden from marrying below his class, might vow himself to a washerwoman at the break of dawn. There were many reasons for secrecy: a difference of station, a disapproving father, an impatient heart. But all shared the same ache, a desire so strong it chose risk over silence. Some found sympathetic priests, hidden away in country chapels, willing to bless such unions in secret. Others spoke the words themselves, looking into each other's eyes, as if their souls could sanctify the bond. But secrecy came with weight. Without official records, their children might be called illegitimate, their futures uncertain, their homes forever one wrong word from ruin. And yet, these moonlit weddings still happened. Because love, true, wild, defiant love, has always found a way, even in ages ruled by men and manuscripts. So as you drift tonight, picture the hidden meadow, the hush between two breaths, the courage it takes to say yes when the world says no. Now, let's move on to the next chapter: elopements and runaway brides. Some stories begin not at the altar, but at the window. The hour is quiet, the town is asleep, and a young woman, veil half-pinned, heart pounding, slips barefoot into the night, her future packed in nothing but a cloth bundle and a prayer. She is a runaway bride, not from fear of marriage itself, but from the marriage chosen for her. In medieval times, love rarely had permission. A daughter was her father's property. To wed was to be traded, to walk the path laid by land, dowry, or alliance. But not all daughters agreed. Sometimes, on the eve of a grand arranged wedding, the bride vanished. No note, no warning. Just a trail of soft footprints in the mud and a stolen horse tied beneath a tree. She ran not just from a man, but from a life scripted without her voice. And more often than you'd think, she didn't run alone. Lovers planned escapes in hushed tones. A baker's boy saving coins under flour sacks. A miller's daughter hiding spare clothes in the barn. Together, they fled toward an uncertain dawn, choosing poverty and exile over silk and suffocation. Their journeys were perilous. To elope was to defy family, church, and law. If caught, punishment ranged from beatings to annulments. But some succeeded. They reached distant towns where names were new and pasts could be folded quietly into legend. To elope in those days was not just to marry for love. It was to rebel, to dream, to believe that two hands held tightly could carry the weight of the world. So close your eyes now and imagine their breathless ride beneath stars, hearts beating like hooves against the earth. Now, let's move on to the next chapter: clergy and love. Breaking sacred vows. He wore robes of devotion. He spoke of eternity, of purity, of resisting the pull of flesh and flame. But behind the altar, behind closed wooden doors and candlelit chambers, the heart beat differently. In the medieval world, clergy were meant to be married only to God. Celibacy was not just an ideal, it was a commandment, a sacred vow. And yet, the human soul, ever tender, ever hungry, rarely obeys without question. There were priests who loved in secret, monks who wrote poetry to women they could not touch, nuns who wept quietly for forbidden affection, slipping letters beneath garden stones, their words trembling with longing and guilt. Some were discovered: a priest caught in a village girl's arms, a nun found with a swollen belly and a silence too deep to be mistaken. Trials followed: excommunication, public shame, lives shattered under the weight of a love that dared to breathe inside holy walls. But many remained hidden. Because love is clever. It disguises itself in sermons, in acts of kindness, in glances exchanged between hymn and prayer. To be clergy and in love was to carry a secret flame, a fire both sacred and forbidden. Some argued they were not breaking vows, but answering a higher call, the pull of soul to soul, the divine echo of Adam and Eve, of connection that predates doctrine. Others were tormented, torn between devotion and desire, wondering if love itself was the true heresy or the truest faith. So tonight, as sleep begins to wrap you in its own quiet vows, consider this. Even in cloisters and cathedrals, hearts bloom, ache, and break, just like yours. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Trials for adultery and forbidden touch. There was once a time when desire itself could put you on trial. Not for murder, not for theft, but for a kiss exchanged in shadows, for a lingering glance that lingered too long, for the tremble in your voice when you said another's name. Adultery in the medieval world was more than sin. It was scandal. It was betrayal of bloodlines, of inheritance, of honor. A married woman's infidelity could call her very soul into question. A man's transgression might be whispered about for generations. But it was the women, always the women, who bore the sharper blade of judgment. Villages held trials for such things. Public, brutal. There were no lawyers, no evidence as we know it. Only stories, rumors, and the gleam in someone's eye who had seen too much or perhaps not enough. There were ordeals. Hands plunged into boiling water, tongues burned by iron, rituals where innocence was measured by scars. And if you healed quickly, they said God had forgiven you. But forgiveness was rare. Punishment could be death or exile, or worse, to remain in the village branded as impure, your name curdled in every mouth that spoke it. And yet, even in this world, people still touched in secret, still risked everything for a moment that felt like eternity. Because love, or lust, or longing, whatever name you give it, does not read law. It does not kneel before social order. Men of power took what they wanted, and women bore the consequences. But some women, with eyes full of fire and defiance, chose to love anyway, to feel, to ache, to be human in a time that demanded otherwise. So now, as you sink deeper beneath your covers, ask yourself quietly, what would you risk for one moment of forbidden touch? Now, let's move on to the next chapter, lovers torn by war. He kissed her hand the night before he left. Not her lips, that would have made it real, and neither of them could bear that. Outside, the world was sharpening swords. Inside, two hearts were breaking in silence. In medieval times, war was not rare. It was rhythm. It was ritual. It was the call of kings and feudal lords, demanding blood to settle borders and pride to stain the fields. But war did not only take lives. It took love. Young men marched under banners, promised land, gold, or honor. But in the folds of their tunics were letters never sent. Tokens from women who watched from the gates, clutching shawls against wind and fate. Sometimes these were betrothed couples, never yet wed, their vows suspended in the unknown. Sometimes secret lovers, forbidden unions ripped apart by duty. And sometimes husbands torn from wives, fathers from unborn children they'd never get to hold. They said, "He'll return by harvest." But harvest came, and the fields bloomed without him, and winter followed. There were women who waited lifetimes, who wore no color again, who raised children alone, telling stories by firelight of a man who once sang beneath their window when they were 16. And there were men who returned, but not the same. Eyes duller, hands colder, haunted not just by battle, but by the image of the one they left behind. Smiling, waving, fading. Love, in times of war, becomes a memory sharpened by absence. a name whispered into pillows, as though saying it could bring them back. So rest now. Imagine the letter never sent, still tucked into his sleeve, still warm with her touch. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the obedient wife. Reality or expectation? She bowed her head at the altar. But did she bow in her heart? In the manuscripts and moral sermons, the perfect wife was quiet, gentle, yielding, a vessel of virtue, a mirror to her husband's will. But the truth was always more tangled than the tale. Medieval texts preached obedience like it was divine law. Wives, submit to your husbands, they said. A wife was to obey not just in action, but in spirit, to think as he thought, to want what he wanted, to become a shadow of his desires. But behind the stone walls of manor houses and inside humble cottages of thatched straw, the real stories breathed. Messy, beautiful, defiant. There were women who played the part, but ruled the home with quiet power, who managed land and livestock, calculated debts and dowries, and raised entire households while their husbands were off at war or court or alehouses. There were wives who resisted, who spoke too loudly, who argued in public, who bore punishments for refusing to bend. They were labeled shrew, witch, or worse, not because they were wicked, but because they dared to have a voice. And there were women who learned the art of subtle disobedience. The long pause before answering, the sideways glance at supper, the silence that said, "I am here, but I am not yours." And still, some truly believed that obedience was love, that yielding was sacred, that devotion required disappearance. The medieval wife was not one thing. She was many, some obedient, some defiant, some torn in half between expectation and self. So tonight, as you lay your head on the pillow, ask softly, what parts of yourself have you quieted just to belong? Now let's move on to the next chapter. The Lady of the Manor. Power behind the curtain. She didn't wear a crown. She didn't speak in court. But within the stone bones of the manor, her word was law. The Lady of the Manor. Not a queen, not a servant, but something in between. She walked the echoing halls with soft steps and carried the burden of a small kingdom balanced on her shoulders. To the world outside, she was a wife, obedient, graceful, and contained. But behind closed doors, she was strategist, steward, and sentinel. While her husband hunted, traveled, or fought in distant wars, she governed. She oversaw the food stores and harvests, managed the staff, organized feasts and alms for the poor, settled disputes among tenants, and kept the manor's heartbeat steady through sickness, famine, and siege. In times of war, she became defender, rallying servants, hiding valuables, negotiating with invaders. In times of peace, she was a diplomat, hosting guests, forging alliances with a single smile at supper. She knew the value of wool and grain, of silence and suspicion. She knew when to bend and when to stand still. Yet her power was always cloaked, not written into law, but felt in the quiet influence of daily life. She couldn't vote or inherit most lands, but she could shape the world within her gates. The Lady of the Manor was never just someone's wife. She was the invisible thread that held everything together. So as you rest, imagine her in the early morning, waking before the sun, looking out over frost-covered fields and planning the day with calm command. Now let's move on to the next chapter, marital relations. What was allowed? Between the walls of wedlock, desire was not always welcome, and yet it stirred beneath woolen sheets, between prayer and procreation. In medieval marriage, the body was not your own, especially if you were a wife. Church doctrine taught that marriage was the only holy place for carnal acts. Anything beyond duty, beyond the command to be fruitful, teetered on the edge of sin. Yet couples still reached for each other in the night. Clergy wrote guidebooks detailing what was permitted and what was not. No intimacy on holy days, none during Lent, none while pregnant or nursing, or during menstruation, or within 40 days of giving birth. And positions? Even those were debated. The missionary position was preferred. Natural, they said. Anything else? Animalistic, sodomitical, or the work of demons in the dark. But who followed these rules? Not everyone. Behind closed doors, desire had its own rhythm. Couples negotiated pleasure with whispers and glances. Some found joy in each other's bodies, despite the heavy veil of guilt. Others endured. Silently, mechanically, a duty performed to maintain peace or produce an heir. And then there were the consequences. A woman who refused her husband's advances could be punished, not just by law, but by God, it was said. To deny him was to deny the bond itself. Yet for men, straying outside the marriage was often overlooked, while women paid in blood and shame. Still, within all these constraints, some couples loved. Truly, they found a sacred space in stolen moments of tenderness, despite the weight of religion, culture, and unspoken fears. And so, as your body sinks into rest, let the question soften. What was allowed? What was hidden? And what was yearned for in the quiet of the marriage bed? Now let's move on to the next chapter, the rite of the first night. Myth or truth? Whispers echo through the centuries. A lord, a trembling bride, and a night not spent with her groom, but in the chambers of power. The rite of the first night. Or jus primae noctis, the supposed law allowing noblemen to claim a peasant bride on her wedding night. It lingers in our imaginations like a specter draped in velvet. But was it real? Historians argue. Some say yes, pointing to scattered records, local legends, and fragments of feudal law. Others insist it was rumor, a tale spun by later generations to paint the past as darker than it truly was. Perhaps the truth lives in the middle, not a written law, but an abuse of power dressed in silence. In isolated villages, did some lords demand favors, knowing the poor could not refuse? There were taxes on weddings, fees for permissions, gifts owed to the manor. And perhaps, in the spaces between those laws, some took liberties no parchment ever recorded. But just as often, this story served another purpose: to explain shame, to justify revolts, to imagine villains in velvet hats while the real injustices lay hidden in plainer clothes. Still, the image remains. A candle flickers. A bride is led away. A groom waits in silence, knowing he cannot stop what is coming. Whether myth or truth, the story reveals something deeper. How deeply we fear power without mercy, and how often bodies, especially women's, are caught between ceremony and control. So as you drift, hold space for those untold stories. Not everything that was real left behind a record. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. The bride's first morning after the night had passed. Whether cloaked in celebration or silence, it gave way to mourning, and with it, a different kind of unveiling. For the medieval bride, the first morning after her wedding was not always a moment of romance or reflection. It was scrutiny. It was ceremony. It was proof. In many noble households, the marriage bed was not just private. It was public record. The bedclothes were inspected, sometimes by mothers-in-law, or even servants instructed to watch. Stains on linens, blood as evidence of virginity, all symbols of honor or disgrace. And if the sheets stayed clean, whispers bloomed like mold in the corners. Was she not pure? Was he not capable? Could the union be annulled? For the bride, the weight was unbearable. Her body was not hers. It was a canvas for family pride, a battlefield of expectation. Some girls were no more than children, 14, 15, married off and asked to prove themselves before they even understood what was being asked of them. There were rituals too, baths with herbs for fertility, offerings to saints, advice whispered from older women, some tender, some terrifying. And yet, not every bride awoke in fear. Some rose in the arms of a kind husband, shared bread and fruit in the soft light of dawn, laughed at nervousness, and stepped into marriage with a strange and gentle hope. But for many, that morning marked the first moment they understood what it meant to belong to someone, entirely. So tonight, as you rest your head, consider what it meant to wake not to a new love, but to a new identity, sealed by a night you didn't choose. Now let's move on to the next chapter, marriage as a holy sacrament. Long before the lace and gold, before the flowers and rings, there was a silence in the chapel, a stillness that carried something deeper than ritual. Marriage was not just a bond between two souls. It was a sacred covenant, a spiritual tether woven by divine hands. In the medieval mind, marriage lived not merely in law, but in liturgy. It was one of the 7 sacraments, a path to holiness, a mirror of Christ and His church. To marry was to enter mystery, to touch something eternal. The church, with its soaring arches and incense trails, claimed the final word on union. Priests stood at the altar, not as witnesses, but as instruments of divine will. And without their blessing, a marriage wasn't just incomplete, it was invisible in the eyes of heaven. Love wasn't necessary. Consent, however, was, at least in theory. A whispered yes from both parties was enough to forge a bond, even in secret, even without parents' permission. But once declared, it was sacred, unbreakable, unforgivable to undo, unless God Himself allowed it. Marriage was a path to grace, a place to bear children, to sanctify desire, to escape the sin of lust through holy union. And yet, even in its sanctity, it carried chains. For women especially, it meant obedience not just to man, but to doctrine, to a church that said her salvation might lie in submission. Still, in its most tender form, marriage brought comfort, a sense that through divine blessing, two could become one flesh, not only in body, but in soul. Tonight, as you drift between thoughts and dreams, know this. Even in a world ruled by parchment and power, the human heart reached for something holy in union. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, papal permissions for cousins to wed. In the quiet stone corridors of medieval monasteries, scrolls traveled faster than horses. And some of the most urgent were not about war or wealth, they were about love. Or more precisely, bloodlines. You see, in the tangled thickets of royal and noble families, everyone was someone's cousin. And as dynasties interwove like vines on an ancient wall, marriage became a puzzle, one that only the Pope could solve. The Church had strict rules. Marriage between close kin was forbidden, not just for morality, but for theology. They feared the merging of flesh that was already too familiar. To marry within 4 degrees of relation, first cousins, second cousins, was seen as spiritual incest. And yet, in courts across Europe, cousins fell in love, or more often, were ordered to preserve land, to protect power, to unite empires without shedding blood. So, noble families turned to Rome. They penned careful letters, wrapped in wax seals and whispered secrets. They begged the Pope for dispensations, holy exceptions. And the Pope, seated beneath golden arches, weighed each plea. Sometimes he allowed it, citing political necessity or lack of options. Sometimes he refused, tearing apart matches that had already begun to blossom. But here's the strange twist. These papal permissions weren't only about law. They became currency. Kings collected them like tokens, and a denied dispensation, it could spark a war. For the commoner, this was a world far removed. But even they knew. Marry your cousin without the church's blessing, and you risked not just scandal, but eternal damnation. Still, hearts rarely followed rules. And so, beneath all the parchment and papal seals, were stories of secret vows, of cousins who chose love over law, of families torn between blood and belief. As the night deepens around you, let your mind wander to a world where love required permission from heaven's gatekeeper, where power and affection tangled like old roots, and every marriage was a move in a sacred game. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, divorce. A sin or salvation? In a time when marriages were bound by sacred oaths and sanctioned by heaven, what happened when love faded? When cruelty replaced kindness? When a heart whispered, "I cannot bear this anymore"? The answer was silence. A long, cold silence from the church. Because in the medieval world, divorce was not a right. It was a sin, a rupture in the divine tapestry of union. To leave a marriage was to turn your back on God's will. It wasn't just frowned upon. It was feared. For the church had declared, "What God has joined, let no man put asunder." But life, as always, was more complex than doctrine. Some women were beaten. Some men were betrayed. There were homes without love, marriages without peace, and nights that stretched out like slow punishments. Still, divorce, as we know it today, did not exist. Instead, there were separations from bed and board, a kind of legal limbo. Husbands and wives could live apart, but they were never free to marry again. To truly dissolve a marriage required a loophole, annulment, a declaration that the marriage was never valid to begin with, that it had been forged in error due to lies, coercion, or consanguinity. And here, again, power mattered. A peasant woman had little hope, but a queen with influence might earn her escape. And so it was not always about justice, but persuasion. Papers were drawn, bishops consulted, the Pope petitioned. Still, many suffered quietly. They stayed, for the sake of reputation, for the safety of their children, or for fear of losing their soul. And yet, in the softest corners of the human heart, the question lingered like a shadow. Could leaving ever be holy? Could freedom be found in walking away? As you drift deeper into the folds of thought, consider how tightly the church gripped the key to freedom, and how, even then, the spirit longed for release. Now let's move on to the next chapter, religious laws versus village customs. The bells of the great cathedrals rang high over kingdoms, but in the valleys below, it was the crackling fire of the village hearth that shaped daily life. Here, beneath thatched roofs and low stone walls, marriage was not just a sacrament. It was a survival pact, a dance between tradition and necessity, between what the church commanded and what the people quietly practiced. Religious law was clear. Marriage had rules, rituals, bans, blessings. You needed witnesses, a priest, sometimes even papal permission. But out in the fields, away from the Latin scrolls and gilded altars, customs told a different story. A couple might simply join hands before the elders. They might pledge themselves at the edge of a forest, or share bread and salt as a sign of union. No priest, no church, just hearts and hands. witnessed by wind and sky. The church called it clandestine marriage. It frowned, it threatened, but it could not undo the binding power of old traditions passed down like lullabies. In many villages, weddings were rowdy and sacred in the same breath, filled with fertility songs, ale-soaked blessings, and rites the church never quite understood. The tension ran deep. Priests preached from pulpits, but midwives whispered their own wisdom. And when disputes arose, when lovers fought or families feuded, it wasn't always bishops who were called, but wise women, village councils, old men who remembered the customs. This quiet resistance wasn't rebellion. It was survival. It was the soul of the people refusing to forget who they were before the robes came. And so marriage in the medieval world was not one story, but two. The sacred and the secret. The holy and the homemade. As you drift deeper, let this paradox soften you. That even in a world ruled by parchment and power, the heart found its own laws. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the wedding mass and its hidden meanings. It began in silence, a hush that wrapped the stone church in breathless stillness. Two figures stood before the altar. The bride veiled in linen or lace, the groom solemn and still. And before them, a priest, robed in gold or simple wool, ready to weave the threads of two souls into one. This was the wedding mass. Not just ceremony, but sacrament, a sacred act meant to echo heaven itself. At first glance, it followed a script. Scripture, sermon, solemn vows, the giving of rings, the kiss of peace. But beneath each word were layers of meaning, whispers of older rituals and spiritual weight that shaped the path of a new life. The Mass reminded them, marriage was not a private affair. It was a public covenant, a mirror of Christ and the Church. The man was the head, the woman the heart. Together, they formed a sacred whole. But deeper still were the hidden signs, the binding of hands with the priest's stole. Not just symbolism, but an echo of ancient handfastings. The placing of the bride on the left. Because in medieval lore, the left was the side nearest the heart. Even the chalice, raised high above their bowed heads, spoke of unity, of sacrifice, of drinking deeply from the same cup, whatever sweetness or sorrow it might contain. The Church taught that this was a holy union, indissoluble, unshakable. But beneath the gold and incense, two human beings stood trembling, not saints, but souls, stepping into mystery. And when the bells rang again, as they stepped out into light, it was not just applause they heard. It was a new silence, a silence that whispered, "Now, everything changes." Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Viking wedding rites. Far from the cloisters and candlelit chapels of Christian Europe, the wind howled through the fjords, and in the land of ice and fire, love was not tender. It was fierce, forged like iron, burning like mead poured over a sacred flame. Viking weddings were not whispers, they were thunder. Here, marriage was more than romance. It was an alliance, a negotiation between families, a promise of blood, wealth, and legacy. Two households became one, not just through emotion, but through oaths, land, livestock, and swords. The bride didn't wear white. She wore a crown of silver or bronze, sometimes forged to resemble the goddess Frigg's sacred weave. Her hair, a symbol of maidenhood, was unbound one final time. And her kransen, a delicate headpiece worn by virgins, was removed in ceremony. She stepped into womanhood, not with fragility, but with power. The groom, too, underwent rites. He might bury a sword to cleanse it of blood, then retrieve it to give as a gift, symbol of protection and peace. The sword was not for war now, but for legacy, for the child who might one day inherit it. Ceremonies often took place near water or sacred groves, and always the gods were called. Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength, Freya for love and fertility. When the vows were spoken, they weren't delicate poems. They were bold oaths, sworn before kin and cosmos, sealed with ale and animal sacrifice, and witnessed by the earth itself. And when night came, they did not walk quietly into their new life. They were carried to their bed, their hands tied in linen, their path lit by torches, their hearts echoing with ancient fire. Now sleep, dear listener, knowing that even in the coldest corners of the medieval world, love still found a way to burn bright. Now, let's move on to the next chapter: Jewish marriage contracts and rituals. In quiet corners of the medieval world, where Torah scrolls whispered stories in candlelight, another kind of union was formed, one built not just on hearts, but on ink and parchment. A Jewish wedding was a contract with heaven and earth. The ketubah, a marriage contract handwritten in flowing Hebrew, was no mere formality. It was sacred, binding, and protective, a promise made by the groom to honor, to provide, to never abandon or abuse. In a world where many women were given, here she was also guaranteed. The rituals began long before the ceremony. The bride, like a queen, would be immersed in the mikveh, a ritual bath of purification where water kissed skin and washed away the past. She emerged glowing, cleansed for a sacred beginning. At the wedding canopy, the chuppah, a simple cloth held high on 4 poles, they stood beneath the sky, symbolizing the home they would build, open on all sides, welcoming to all, rooted in faith. 7 blessings were spoken. Wine was sipped. The ketubah was read aloud, each word a shield of dignity, a testament to mutual respect. It wasn't about obedience. It was about partnership. And at the end, the breaking of the glass, a sudden shatter, a reminder of the temple's destruction, of sorrow that still echoes in joy, of the fragility of love and its resilience. The crowd would cheer, Mazel Tov, but deep within, there was silence, a silence filled with awe that 2 souls had found one another across deserts of history and exile. Now, let's move on to the next chapter: Byzantine marriage. Gold and grandeur. In the golden heart of Constantinople, where domes shimmered like halos and mosaics glittered under candlelight, marriage was not just a joining. It was spectacle. It was empire. It was theology clothed in silk and light. A Byzantine wedding began not in a chapel, but in whispers of diplomacy and dowries. For noble families, marriage was strategy, a bridge between houses, a calculation wrapped in roses. Yet even the humblest bride carried herself like a saint in an icon. Her robes were rich with embroidery, often spun with threads of crimson and gold. Her veil, delicate as incense smoke, shrouded a face serene and solemn. She wasn't just a woman. She was a vessel of grace, an image of purity, a bearer of future generations. The ceremony took place in the church, where divine liturgy met human longing. There were no spoken vows. Instead, the ritual was woven in actions. The crowning was central. Wreaths or jeweled crowns were placed upon bride and groom, not as rulers of kingdoms, but of their new sacred household. The priest blessed them in the name of the Trinity, invoking saints and angels to watch their union unfold. They sipped from a common cup, symbolizing the sweetness and bitterness they would now share, and hand in hand, they circled the altar 3 times, a mystical dance where steps mirrored eternity and the divine watched quietly. Outside, music might play, bread would be broken, coins might be tossed. But within, something ancient had occurred. So if your eyes are growing heavy, let your dreams take you through marble corridors and candlelit domes. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Hindu marriages in medieval South Asia, beneath banyan trees and temple bells, where jasmine wafted through warm air and chants rose like mist from the earth. A marriage in medieval South Asia was never merely an event. It was a cosmic act, a binding of souls across lifetimes, a vow whispered to gods, ancestors, and time itself. Even before the bride and groom met, fates were calculated through horoscopes. The stars, above silent witnesses, were consulted to bless or warn. The union wasn't just emotional. It had to be astrologically precise. After all, the threads of karma were delicate. The bride was often very young and adorned like a goddess, her hands henna'd with sacred symbols, her body scented with turmeric and sandalwood. Gold gleamed at her wrists and ears, not just as beauty, but as fortune, as protection, as inheritance in a world where women had so little. The wedding itself was a tapestry of rituals. Fire, blazed at the center. Around it, they walked 7 times, saptapadi. Each step a vow, to nourish, to grow, to stand by each other in sorrow and joy, in faith and in legacy. With each round, they were not just lovers. They were co-travelers in dharma, in purpose, in the eternal cycle of life. Priests chanted Vedic mantras, their voices deep and ancient, as if echoing from another realm. Rice was offered to the flames. Threads were tied around necks, foreheads marked with vermilion. The world around them paused, as the invisible world leaned in to listen. Afterward, the bride was led to her new home, sometimes weeping softly behind her veil, leaving the known for the unknown. A rite of passage lived in countless hearts. So now, let those flames flicker in your thoughts, and the soft jingle of anklets lull you to sleep. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Celtic hand fasting. In misty glens where wild heather grows, and stone circles whisper forgotten vows, the Celts had their own way of sealing the bond between two souls, not with parchment or priest, but with cord and intention. In a rite called hand fasting, there was no cathedral, no towering spire to witness, only the forest canopy, the hum of earth beneath bare feet, and the quiet gaze of the moon. Who had watched many such unions before? Hand fasting was ancient, older than empires. It began with a gathering, small or large, sacred or simple. A couple would stand, facing one another, hands joined together right to right, left to left, and a cord would be wrapped gently around them. The tying of the hands, where we get the phrase tying the knot. But here, it was no metaphor. It was real. Wool, leather, braided ribbon, whatever the couple chose, as long as it held the energy of promise. Vows were spoken not from law books, but from the heart, words woven with wind and will. I bind to you in the presence of earth and sky, sometimes for a year and a day, a trial of sorts, sometimes for eternity. If the stars agreed, there were no crowns, no bishops in embroidered robes, just the sacredness of presence. And if the gods were kind, perhaps a hawk would cry above, or a rainbow arc through the fog. Afterward, there might be dancing by firelight, a feast of wild boar and berry wine, laughter echoing through valleys, that had known love long before stories were written. Tonight, as your breath deepens, feel that ancient knot, soft and sure around your own dreaming wrists. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Omens on the wedding day. In the quiet hours before a medieval wedding, long before the first bell tolled, eyes turned not just to the altar, but to the sky, the birds, the dreams from the night before. For in those days, marriage was not just a matter of heart and house. It was a gamble with the unseen. The entire village, breath held, would watch for signs. A raven circling overhead? Perhaps a warning. A hare darting across the path? Good fortune, if it ran left to right. Rain at dawn could cleanse old sins. But a shattered cup, that meant misalignment. A union not blessed by fate. Even the dress had omens sewn into its seams. A needle pricked while hemming? Trouble in the union. Spilling salt in the bride's chamber? Invite for misfortune. But if the candle on the windowsill held its flame still, if a robin sang outside the door, then peace, it was said, would walk beside them. Dreams, too, held meaning. If the bride dreamt of roses, love would be true. Of storms, then passions might clash. And if a groom dreamt of wolves, his loyalty might be tested. There were whispers of flowers to avoid, yellow ones for jealousy, white lilies for death. But violets meant humility, and marigolds hope blooming in hard soil. Every sound, every subtle flicker of the world felt like a whisper from the divine. It made the morning feel electric, alive with invisible threads, tugging at what could become a lifetime. Now, close your eyes and imagine. If your own life had been foretold by signs, what omens would have marked your wedding day? Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Spells for fertility. In the hush that follows a wedding feast, when the candles grow low and the stars press close to listen, there begins a different kind of longing. Not for kisses, but for continuation, for lineage, for life to bloom in another. Fertility. It was the quiet hope wrapped in every marriage vow, the secret prayer whispered beneath veils and furs. But in medieval times, hope alone wasn't enough. So, they turned to magic, to herbs, charms, and sacred words. A bride might tuck a sprig of mugwort beneath her pillow. On the first night of union, a dream herb said to open the womb to the moon's rhythm. Or she might drink a tea of raspberry leaves, steeped under a waxing crescent, gentle, warming, preparing the body to welcome the unseen. Some women wore belts of braided red thread, knotted with whispered names of goddesses, Brigid, Freya, Isis, calling upon ancient mothers who knew the ache of waiting. Others placed tiny figurines beneath the bed, clay cradles, seed-shaped stones, symbols to invite the spirit of the unborn to settle in peace. And sometimes a midwife came, not with instruments, but with incantations. She'd walk circles around the couple's bed, sprinkling lavender and fennel, speaking verses known only to women, whose hands had caught the cries of birth and wiped away the sweat of pain. None of this was guaranteed, but it gave shape to longing. It gave comfort to those whose wombs stayed silent for too long. Now, as you drift deeper, feel the hush of centuries of women, all hoping, all trying, all singing quietly to the future. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Drinking honey. The first honeymoon. Before the idea of a beach getaway, before hotels and silk sheets and plane tickets, there was a cup of honeyed wine and a month of seclusion beneath the stars. That was the honeymoon. But why honey? Why the moon? And what exactly was being sweetened? In medieval times, a honeymoon wasn't just a celebration. It was a sacred buffer between the old life and the new, The word itself, honi moon, spoke of sweetness and cycle, of golden beginnings and lunar tides, of love in bloom and love's deep transformation. It was believed that drinking mead, a fermented wine made from honey, each night for one full moon cycle after the wedding, would increase fertility, bless the bond, and soften any lingering doubts. Between two souls now stitched together, this ritual was part medicine, part myth. Honey was sacred, offered to gods, used in ointments, a symbol of pleasure, nourishment, seduction. And the moon? It governed tides, blood, emotions, a feminine power older than words. Together, honey and moon wove a quiet kind of magic. The newlyweds would retreat, sometimes to a family cottage, sometimes just to a chamber by candlelight. No guests, no obligations, only time, the slow unfolding of intimacy, and the soft buzz of bees in memory. Elders would gift them jars of mead, blessing the couple to sip each night, letting sweetness linger on their lips, as they learned the language of shared silence, the rhythm of another heartbeat beside their own. And maybe that's the real gift, a pause long enough to fall, not just in love, but into each other. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Forbidden colors and days. Not every day was meant for a wedding. Not every color was meant to be worn. In the medieval world, where signs and omens shaped decisions more than logic, the timing and tones of a wedding could mean the difference between a blessed union and a cursed one. There were days you simply didn't marry. Wednesdays were suspect too changeable. Fridays belonged to sorrow. And Sundays, though holy, were reserved for God, not for lovers. Even the moon's position could dictate whether vows should be spoken. A waxing moon? Good for growth, for unions that might swell with children and joy. But a waning moon? That was a bad omen, a warning of things that might shrink or fade. And then there were the colors. Today we imagine brides in white, but in medieval times, white was not the rule. It wasn't even always welcome. Blue was favored, the color of the Virgin Mary, of fidelity, of skies that watched without judgment. Gold symbolized wealth and divinity. Green whispered of youth and fertility, though too much green might draw envy or signal moral looseness. Red was dangerous, a color of lust, of blood, of bad omens, unless you were noble enough to tame its fire. Black? Reserved for mourning. Wearing it to a wedding invited whispers of death before the first anniversary. Even flowers and ribbons carried their own language. Too many yellow blooms could mean jealousy, while purple hinted at arrogance or forbidden nobility. So a bride would choose carefully, not just what looked beautiful, but what spoke to the unseen, to the winds, to the saints, to the ancient voices she could feel, tugging at her veil. Now, let's move on to the next chapter, the binding knot and ancient gods. Long before marriage was a Christian sacrament, before vows were whispered in Latin beneath cathedral arches, there were knots, soft, deliberate, sacred knots, tied by hand and held by heaven. To bind was to promise, not just in words, but in string, in chord, in ritual motion. Across many medieval and pagan cultures, the hand-fasting ritual lingered, a holdover from older, earth-rooted beliefs. During the ceremony, a ribbon or cord was gently wrapped around the hands of the couple, binding left to left, heart to heart, not tied too tightly, just enough to feel the connection, the weight of intention. The binding knot symbolized unity, but also something deeper, a calling upon the gods to witness what no human court could judge. These weren't just legal ties, they were elemental. Fire, water, air, and earth, all woven into a gesture. that said, "I see you, I choose you, I stand beside you." In Celtic tradition, this act was sacred to the gods of the forest, of harvest, of the sun and moon. To the Norse, such knots echoed promises made, under the watch of Frigg or Freya, goddesses of love, fate, and fertility. Some believed the knot had to remain for a full day, or until the wedding night was complete. Others untied it as part of the ceremony's end, letting it symbolize freedom and union, not captivity. Even today, when someone says they're tying the knot, they are echoing this ancient moment, where two lives became interlaced, not by law, but by sacred gesture, and the old, silent gods watching from the trees. Now, let's move on to the next chapter: mourning dress and years of silence. Love doesn't always end with goodbye. Sometimes it echoes on, clinging to fabric, to silence, to the emptiness of an unshared bed. In the medieval world, the death of a spouse marked not just a loss, but the beginning of a long ritual of restraint. For the widow, grief wasn't private. It was worn. Mourning dress wasn't merely black. It was shadow made visible. A tapestry of modest veils, long hems, and heavy cloaks that whispered of sorrow. With every step, no gold, no bright embroidery, no joyous colors. Even the eyes were downcast, not just in pain, but in expectation. A noblewoman might mourn for a year, a queen even longer. Some would retreat into convents, not necessarily for prayer, but to escape the pressure to remarry too soon. There were unspoken rules. How much laughter was too much? How long before you wore color again? Could you attend a wedding while still dressed for the funeral? For men, too, mourning existed, though often softened by duty. A widower might wear black, but was expected to remarry, if lineage demanded it. Grief had a timeline in society's eyes, but the heart followed no such clock. Some carried love like a ghost, visible only in their quiet pauses, their refusal to speak, of springtime or music. Even children noticed the hush, how mother moved slower, how the candles were lit earlier, how bedtime stories ended with sighs. Yet within all that silence, a strange kind of beauty survived. The devotion of memory, the dignity of longing, the way absence could be as present as breath. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Second, marriages and social taboos. It begins quietly. A glance that lingers, a conversation that feels like sunlight after a long, cold hush. But for the medieval widow or widower, love's return wasn't just unexpected, it was suspect. Second marriages were tangled in a web of unspoken rules, both legal and spiritual, and weighed down by the expectations of families, communities, and the church. In many cases, the church permitted remarriage, especially for men of stature, whose lands or titles demanded heirs. But the tone was different. It wasn't celebration. It was utility, a practical arrangement, a duty fulfilled. Yet for women, especially noble widows, a second marriage often drew whispers. Was she too eager to move on? Did she marry beneath her station this time? Was this union for love or survival? A widow with children had more to consider. Would her new husband protect her sons? Would he honor her late husband's memory, or erase it? In tight-knit villages, where memories were long, and judgment came with each market day, even the decision to remarry could become a quiet rebellion. Still, there were those who did it for love, who dared to laugh again, to feel desire flicker beneath the grief. They defied the calendar of mourning, and in doing so, reclaimed a piece of themselves that had gone missing in the dark. Second marriages could be softer, wiser, not filled with the fire of youth, but the warmth of mutual knowing. Two people choosing, not out of pressure, but out of gentle, earned want. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. Marriage for protection, not passion. Not all marriages begin with love. Some begin with danger, with fear, with silence, with a question whispered in the night. What will happen to me now? In medieval times, to be a widow was to stand alone, in a world that rarely made space. For a woman without a man, no husband meant no shield. Against poverty, against accusation, against the wandering hands of power. So many women, especially those without land, sons, or powerful kin, married again, not to fall in love, but to find protection. A second husband might be older, stern, less tender, but he brought safety, a roof, a name, a sword at the door. In castles and cottages alike, these marriages were quiet. There were no songs sung for them, no garlands strung across the hearth. Just the soft clink of dishes shared, the turning of keys, the silent understanding between two people who had seen too much to dream recklessly again. Sometimes the man was widowed too, and in their mutual aloneness, they built something unexpected. Not passion, but peace. Children, if they came, were welcomed more gently, with less fear and more knowing. And sometimes, against all odds, tenderness crept in through the cracks. A touch on the arm, a glance across the firelight. Not desire's storm, but the stillness after it. So rest now, with the knowledge that even the most practical unions held seeds of something sacred. Safety, sanctuary, a shared roof beneath the weather of the world. Now, let's move on to the next chapter. When love remerged from grief, there comes a day, often when you least expect it, when the mourning veil feels too heavy to wear any longer. The ache dulls into memory, and in its place, a faint warmth flickers. Not joy, not yet, but the possibility of it. For some in the medieval world, this return of feeling was frightening. How dare the heart stir again? When the grave was still fresh, how dare one smile? When sorrow was supposed to last a lifetime. But love is relentless in its quiet return. It might begin in a market square, with a stranger offering a basket of pears. It might come through a window, with the scent of spring rain, reminding the heart what softness feels like. Widows and widowers, long silenced by grief, sometimes found themselves laughing again. Not the loud laughter of youth, but a gentler sound, cracked open by surprise. And in that laughter, there lived the ghost of hope. Sometimes the new love was forbidden by family, scorned by neighbors, or frowned upon by priests, who mistook grief for obligation. But the heart is older than law, and when love returned, it did not erase what came before. It did not ask for comparison or permission. It simply arrived. A second sun, a new chapter. Love, reborn from grief, is different. It is quieter, kinder, rooted in deep knowing. It blooms not despite sorrow, but through it. So if you've ever wondered whether your heart can love again after loss, it can. And now, let us gently close this journey with a final blessing. Now, let's move on to the final chapter, the sleeping bride of time. And so, we come to the end, not of love, but of the story that holds it. Imagine her now, this bride not made of flesh or bone, but of memory, myth, and time. She lies beneath layers of centuries, wrapped in lace spun from forgotten vows, her breath the whisper of parchment, her dreams made of candlelight. The sleeping bride of time. She does not age. She waits, not for a groom, but for remembrance. For every culture, every people, left her something at her bedside. A garland of rosemary, a golden ring, a lullaby carried on the wind. She dreams of union, not just of people, but of spirit and soil, of past and present, of the eternal and the ordinary. She holds in her heart the contracts written in ink and in silence, the kisses stolen and the ones denied, the prayers uttered on bridal nights, and the tears shed by candle stubs. She remembers them all, the child bride in her velvet shoes, the runaway lovers beneath a moonlit hedge, the widow lighting a single flame on the night she dared to feel again. In her sleep, she binds them gently, every ring placed with trembling hands, every name changed, every story shared beneath a roof where bread was broken and babies were born. She is the keeper of every unspoken promise. She is time, cradling love as it grows, shatters, and grows again. And as you drift now into the quiet waters of your own sleep, may her presence comfort you. May you feel the hush of all who came before, their voices softened by years, their love echoing like lullabies in the cathedral of your dreams. Rest well, dear listener. The story sleeps with you now.